Hello and welcome to IMCAT's post-session legislative update. I'm Clay Avery from the Instructional Materials Coordinators Association of Texas, or IMCAT as we like to be called. We wanted to be sure and give you all the latest information that affects the instructional materials world from the 85th regular session of the Texas Legislature, and here to do that is IMCAT's Legislative Counsel, Colby Nichols from the firm of Powell and Leon. And without any further ado, Colby, take it away.
Thank you, Clay. I appreciate it. So brief updates from the last webcast that we had. Just to let you all know, today actually we're anticipating a special session announcement. Still don't know what's going to be on the call as of the recording of this tape, but we do know that we're pretty sure that he's going to call it today at 2:30, and so we'll be on the lookout for that. Obviously, if school finance is thrown into the call, then we'll have to evaluate how deeply we want to get involved in that. Very briefly, I just want to kind of go over some of our previous slides that we went over with some updates. This legislative session was very inefficient. Some would argue very ineffective. And you can see that just by looking at the numbers. We had the lowest amount of bills passed since 1995. Last session, there was 1,323 bills passed. And just as a reminder, we almost nearly always have more bills passed from the previous session. This session, it was 1,100 and some change. So what we're looking at is potentially, depending on how much the governor decides to veto, we could end up at 1,000 or below for legislation that truly did pass. So as of Friday, there are 32 House bills and Senate bills that have been filed without the governor's signature, which means they've become law, and there's 405 bills that he has signed. And so, he has until June 18th to make his final decisions, whether he's going to veto. If he allows it to sit or sign it, it becomes law. And so we're on the lookout to see. There's various pieces of legislation, obviously, that we're interested in. Going briefly to the budget, you can see on the graphics, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you can see sort of the breakdown of how the state spends its money, specifically when it comes to children. And you'll also notice that several of the indicators have shrunk due to the cuts this legislative session, as well as general revenue took a $1.2 billion cut, which you can see by the numbers there. This is sort of the issue that we identified in the webcast and ongoing through the session with the cuts to the IMA. Those cuts were used to help boost up the lack of general revenue. And so using funny math, obviously they were able to say that they could certify that the budget matched their expenses. So this is one of the things I think we're going to see ongoing if the IMA continues to be cut, especially. And so we are hopeful that the legislature is not setting the precedent, but it doesn't look good. Which brings us to the IMA specifically. Essentially, the Senate had a $104 million cut. The House had $125. They went with the Senate's version of this piece of the budget plus $10 million. So essentially what we came out with was $94 million cut of the overall fund. Again, it's more money this biennium than it was last biennium, but it's a cut nonetheless and sets a bad precedent. The other thing that we have to think about is obviously there are some expenses that weren't accounted for when the budget was passed. Expenses like, and even though there's not a rider for it, it's going to be interesting to see how they handle it, but the web portal to replace IMCAT, as well as some of the open education resources legislation, all those things were completely unaccounted for and did not go through the appropriations process. and ultimately ended up nearly an entire rewrite of Chapter 31, which is, of course, the Instructional Materials chapter. We didn't see anything change on the school finance front, so I'm going to skip past that. Vouchers were obviously dead. Again, this could come up in a special session. We're not aware if that's something he's going to put on the call. I think the House will hold firm if he does put it on the call and continue to say no to public funds going to private entities. And then I want to move over to accountability. This sort of indirectly touches you. As many of you know, last session we had House Bill 2804, which rewrote our accountability system and put it in 5 domains, and allowed for various ways to take pressure off from the standardized exams. House Bill 22 is not exactly what the school community was hopeful for, but it is definitely an improvement to the A through F system, and I think you're going to see some changes at the State Board as well as TEA in response to the passing of this legislation. Moving on to instructional materials specifically, the state adopted open education resources. That did pass. Changing the name, that also passed, so now that it's the instructional materials and technology allotment. It created a technology lending grant, and it also created a web portal. And I just want to mention that IMCAT opposed a couple of these bills, and we ultimately were able to stop the bills themselves, but they were attached as amendments to larger pieces of legislation. In one instance, they were attached to a piece of legislation that only dealt with higher education when it first came out of committee. So we fell victim of the last minute amendment process, and so what we're looking to do now is to lobby the governor to make the decision on whether to veto this or not. We've been in contact with his office, and there may be an opportunity for us to insert ourselves into that conversation. With regards to instructional materials going forward, again, going back to the precedent that was set with the Budget Committee, if we continue on the path that we're on, it's going to be interesting to see what the State Board of Education ultimately decides when setting the distribution rate, because if they decide that, for instance, that they're not going to raise the distribution rate, I think a big reason why would be because they understand the legislature is just going to take their cut off the top. And so this goes into the larger problem of education funding not going to education, going to various other projects and general revenue in general. And so this is something we're definitely going to have to keep an eye on, and something that we are actively talking to agency officials as well as state representatives and state senators. Clay, that's about all I have regarding the various pieces of legislation that came through on IMA. We definitely need to get a start on the next legislative session. It's never too early to get started on that, and I think we need to watch through June 18th to see what the governor does on those various pieces of legislation, because he very well could veto some of those.
Just real quick, HB 21, which was the school finance bill, I think that was Huberty's, correct?
Yes.
That did not, that died in the Senate, correct?
That's correct.
Last minute, we're going to hold things up. If you're going to hold our stuff up, Senate, House.
Exactly.
Squabble. So basically, it was a tough session to get anything passed for everyone. Basically, it sounds like
it was a very difficult session for everyone, and lobbyists to lobbyists, we were always discussing, and the big joke became, is anyone having a good session?
Right.
And truth be told, anyone that was involved with government entities probably did not have a very good session.
So let me ask you this: what, for our member coordinators out there, what who are watching this, maybe you're in a summer institute watching this right now, and you're new to the IM world, or maybe you're an old veteran who's done this for a few years. Regardless of that, what should they be doing? What would you suggest for just your everyday district employee or OECS employee who is dealing with this? What can they be doing?
Right.
Or what should they be watching for?
Sure. Well, obviously, keep looking for our updates from the Capitol as well as from the agency during the state board meetings. But one of the things that I think everyone should do is contact the representative and senator and let them know what they do. Because the IMA is very mysterious to many legislators, unfortunately. And so we need to explain things. For instance, open education resources. We need to explain that those are great supplemental materials, but they can't replace some of our foundational curriculum materials and textbooks in general. Because right now, a lot of the legislature thinks that OER is the best thing since sliced bread. And so we're going to have to do a good job of convincing them why it's a bad move to put everything on OER, as well as I'll just mention that we're going to spend $20 million on OER, and the benefit of OER supposedly was that it's free. So, I think there's a big question, why are we spending so much money on something that's supposed to be free or cheap? And so, again, those are arguments that need to be made. It needs to be made clear. Senator Taylor out of Galveston, one of the things that he said about cutting the IMA was we could cut the IMA because we had OER. Just give every kid an iPad and OER, and we won't have to spend money on textbooks anymore. And that sort of talk is dangerous for the coordinators especially.
And it's important to let your representative, your senator, know that what you do, who you are, how your district works in getting instructional materials to your students, and how these changes impact your ability to do your job and your ability to serve your students. And with that, I think we're pretty much going to wrap up. Again, today, this very minute or in a few minutes, the Governor Abbott may be calling a special session. We'll see how that goes. We'll see how things fall out with the veto process. So please do stay tuned to IMCAT's future updates. But for now, for Colby Nichols, I'm Clay Avery, and thank you.